Hello friends, welcome to webinar 3B, Poetic Forms 1. In this webinar I'm going to demonstrate to you 5 of the traditional poetic forms, and this will be the first of 2 webinars where we'll look at the breadth and scope of poetic forms across literature. So let's begin. So what is form in literature? Well, it can be very tough to describe it technically, but you can look at form as a traditional way to construct, arrange, or coordinate the parts of a specific type of literary text. A form is a set of rules for how a literary text is composed. And those rules become stable, distinctive, and accepted based on their shared literary features. Why would you have a form? Well, because if certain forms can be reproduced. If a poet wanted to write a sonnet, and specifically a Shakespearean sonnet, the rules for Shakespearean sonnet writing are available and well known. So that poet would just merely need to consult those rules and then write the sonnet in accordance with them. Forms allow poets to train to write poetry. Authors can practice using different forms, and how well they execute those forms allows them to build competence in that particular form, and that competencies they can take into other forms. Forms also allow poems to be compared. So if someone wrote a haiku and another person, a literary critic, wanted to compare that haiku to a different one, the amount of compliance to the rules of haiku could be one of those things that the critic made a judgment about. Form makes literature predictable and familiar. Limericks are the same, or at least similar in form, across all limericks. We can look at the form of a limerick now. So up in the upper right-hand corner of the chart, you can read that a limerick is a humorous 5-line poem made up of 13 stressed syllables. Our description here calls them beats, but essentially they're stressed syllables, with an AABBA rhyme scheme. Here's an example. There was a young boy from Kaboo who had trouble tying his shoe. He said to his ox, "I'll just walk in my socks." Now all his friends do that too. You can see that the first 2 lines each has 3 stressed syllables. Second pair of lines has 2 stressed syllables. Said ox walks in socks. And then finally the last line has 3 stressed syllables, just like the first 2 lines. All friends and two. Another way to consider form is that form fulfills the human compulsion to organize and categorize like phenomena. Our minds and our brains are pattern recognition machines, essentially, that are acutely tuned to difference and similarity. It's a part of our predator nature and also our nature as prey animals. That ability to tell the difference between things and similarities between things helped our ancestors, our prehistoric ancestors, survive by being able to gather food and game and also not become some other animal's meal. So our brains work to organize things that are alike and separate out things that are different. Another way to look at this metaphorically is by thinking of a donut. If literature is the whole, then the form is the donut around the whole. Here's here's another way to look at form. We'll take it from the realm of visual arts. So I'm going to create a seascape, and a seascape is essentially a depiction of the planet involving ocean. So I found myself a depiction of a beach with a horizon going out, ocean going out to the horizon. Then I have a set of subjects, this family, a sailboat, and then finally a biplane that is pulling a banner that you see at the ocean. The family, they're probably 3 to 6 feet tall, each one of them. The sailboat, anywhere from 10 to 25 feet tall. And then the aircraft would be 8 to 15 feet tall from its landing gear, bottom of its landing gear, to the top of its upper wing. So those are the dimensions. If I put those images onto a seascape, there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background. But if you don't adjust for perspective and proportion, you don't have much of a seascape here. You just have 3 images that are laid up on a depiction of the ocean. If I obey the form of a seascape and I adhere to the rules of perspective and proportion, I'll have something that looks a little bit more like a example of a visual artifact. So now my family is in the foreground and they're larger than the sailboat that in real life is larger than the family, much larger. But if you put it in the middle ground, you have to shrink it down so it becomes in the appropriate proportion and perspective. And then finally, my aircraft, which is in the far background, is going to be much smaller than the family or the sailboat because I'm obeying the rules of the form of a seascape. This is what form allows us to do. Let's take a look at 5 of the forms of poetry that it'll help to know when you're close reading a poetic text. Here's the first one. It's a Petrarchian sonnet. Petrarch was the founder of essentially the Renaissance and the humanism that propelled the Renaissance. He was an artist and a poet and a writer, a politician, a scholar, and he developed a form of poetry that included 2 stanzas, each of 7 lines, for a total of 14 lines. All sonnets have 14 lines, but a Petrarchian sonnet has a particular form, whereas the first stanza, 7 lines, presents some sort of a question or an issue. And then the second stanza of 7 lines resolves that question or solves that issue philosophically or practically or thoughtfully, intellectually, if you will. And in the middle, around lines 8 or 9, there's a distinct change where the poet goes from presenting a question or issue to resolving it. Now we call that sort of change a turn. It's a distinct change in tone, narration, or theme. So let's listen to John Milton's Sonnet 19. It's about his struggle with blindness. He became blind during his life. And his sense of religious duty.
When I consider how my light is spent, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, And that one talent which is death to hide lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve therewith my Maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labor, light denied, I fondly ask? But patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies, God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait.
Now, this is a sophisticated text. Its meaning isn't apparent with just one reading, so it needs to be close read. But a part of that close reading process is to identify the form, and this is an example of the form of a Petrarchan sonnet. Next, the Shakespearean sonnet. William Shakespeare created this form of sonnet. Also has 14 lines, but those 14 lines are arranged into 3 4-line stanzas, also called a quatrain. It has a fixed rhyme scheme, which is the first line rhymes with the 4th line, and the second and third line in a stanza. Let me restate. The first line rhymes with the third line, and the second line rhymes with the 4th line. And then that repeats in the first and second quatrain. At the end, during the third quatrain, the last 2 lines are rhymed. And that's called a heroic couplet. Let's have a listen to Sonnet 130 by William Shakespeare.
Sonnet 130. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun? If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare.
Just like our Petrarchan sonnet by Milton, the meaning of this requires some deliberate and close reading. But the form is fixed. Next, we'll have a look at a villanelle. A villanelle is a 6-stanza poem. The first 5 stanzas are called tercets, which is a 3-line stanza, and the final stanza is a quatrain, 4-line stanza. But this is where things get even more interesting. In a villanelle, the first line is repeated in the 6th line, the 12th line, and the 18th line. So it becomes a refrain. It's referred to as A1. And then the 3rd line in the poem is repeated in lines 9, 15, and 19. It's called refrain 2, or A2. And within each stanza, in the tercets, the 3-line stanzas, the rhyme scheme is stable and rhyme across all the stanzas. So the rhyme scheme for the tercet 1 is ABA, and that rhyme scheme is repeated in tercet 2, ABA. For example, line 1, night. Line 4, right. Line 3, light. Line 6, night. And that remains stable all the way till you get to the quatrain, where the rhyme scheme changes to ABAA. But they rhyme back through the tercets that preceded them. Here is an example, a very famous example of a villanelle, which is also a Renaissance form. And it's done by Dylan Thomas from 1947. Do not go gently into that good night.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Again, very sophisticated set of elements. The form is very complex and very rigid, but I think you'd all agree that there's a certain melody and rhythm that is significant. That's a villanelle. Our next form is haiku. Haiku is a Japanese form of poetry. It has been adopted into the Western canon. Very popular. This is by Basho. Basho is one of the two masters of this particular poetic form. This was produced around 1650, and it's called By the Old Temple. By the old temple, peach blossoms, a man treading rice. What makes this a haiku? It's got 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables. Second line has 3 syllables. And the final line, the third line, has 5 syllables. I've broken down the syllabic rhythm on the right. By the old temple, that's 5. Peach blossoms, 3. A man treading rice, 5. That's haiku. Again, very structured, very abstract, and very popular, especially with young people learning about poetry. Very accessible. What's next? Next is free verse. Now, free verse is a form of poetry, but it's absent of form. There is no formal arrangement. There is no stable rhyme scheme. It doesn't have to rhyme at all. There are no rules to a free verse poem. And its recitation is based on normal pauses and rhythms that you hear in vocal speech. This poem is by William Carlos Williams from 1934, and it's called This Is Just to Say. Now, I've taken this poem as it was recited in the 2017 film Patterson. In this scene, the main character, who's a bus driver and a writer, comes out in the morning and greets his wife, who is busy baking cupcakes. And they share a intimate moment with this poem.
Wow. This looks fantastic, baby.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Who's sitting in Daddy's chair? Who's sitting in Daddy's chair, huh? William Carlos Williams?
Oh, no. William Carlos.
Will you read me that one I love so much?
This is just to say, coming up. This is just to say, I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me. They were delicious. So sweet and so cold.
Oh, I love that poem.
Oh, that's a good one.
And some of yours are just as good.
Well,
Now remember your promise.
I promised.
I better get going.
Again, no rules in a free verse poem. Doesn't mean that the free verse poet can't borrow from other forms, but there are no set structural rules. You'll find that most poetry produced from the 20th century on into the present day is free verse. If you see contemporary poems that adhere to established forms, it's often ironically or satirically. Free verse poetry is very common today. Friends, I'd like you to take on assignment 29. You'll find this on Canvas. Assignment 29 will present you with 5 different poems. Each is an example of one of the 5 forms we've discussed in this webinar today. Simply match the poem to the form it represents. That brings us to the end of our webinar. Next time we'll look at 5 more different forms of poetry in webinar 3D.